Hayden White. The historical text is literary artifact. Article summary and review. The form of narrative has traditionally served as a way of delivering events with a story. The historical narrative is often perceived as a series of events presented in a chronological order with the form of a story. The narrative is a way of representing them. In this, the notion of the historical narrative, then the manner in which it is related to in classical narratology, at least as far as its more traditional understanding of narrative goes. This perception of narrative distinguishes fictional time and story time in a manner fitting with the premise of structuralism. In his The Historical Text as Literary Artifact, Hayden White perceives narrative as a prose-written lingual utterance that has a development of events in a way that grants them with coherence and understandability. Hayden White views narrative as a complex of events spread across a sequence of verbally organized times in a manner that creates a gradual development of the events into a comprehensible form. Other philosophers that preceded Hayden White have already pointed out the fact that narrative grants historical events coherence, but Hayden White was the first to suggest the importance of their structuring in prose. In The Historical Text as Literary Artifact, Hayden White argues that the same series of chronological events could be narrated in different manners by stressing different parts of the series of events, an action which he terms emplotment. Hayden White does not mean by this interference or change in the order of the historical events in the historical narrative, but simply to a different construction of the same series of event in light of essentially literary conventions and through different emphasis of different events. Hayden White lists four main types of emplotment, which are tragedy, satire, comedy and romance. Hayden White is without a doubt one of the more influential history philosophers starting from the late 70s till present day. Though some consider him the herald of postmodernism in history, he himself does not consider himself as a postmodernist, and indeed a close inspection of his thought reveals a tendency towards traditional thought, mainly in his structural approach towards narrative. The Historical Text, a Literary Artifact, is one of Hayden White's most notable works that illustrate some of his key notions on history and narrative. Additional summary. In Historical Text as Literary Artifact, Hayden White compares historiography with literature. Historians must rely on a historical imagination, such as filling in the blanks or making assumptions about events. History is a constructive enterprise, and historians are trained to perceive patterns that may or may not have actually existed. If historians rely on the historical imagination, as they must to complete their task, then historiography and historical literature are qualitatively similar. White admits that the conflation of mythic and historical consciousness will offend some historians and disturb literary theorists. 1713. Yet these two seemingly distinct disciplines have more points of convergence than is often assumed. The sensitivity surrounding White's claim stems from a common presumption that historiography equals absolute fact, whereas literature equals absolute fiction. In The Historical Text as Literary Artifact, Hayden White, a historian in the field of literary criticism, clearly articulates what meta-history is, in an attempt to help his readers better understand the epistemological status of historical explanations, the form historical representations take, and history's role in knowledge-making. White argues historical narratives are more closely linked with literature than the sciences, not because historical narratives are fictional, but because historical narratives employ tropes, metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony to configure historical events in ways that the audience can relate to. Historians, White explains, re-emplot, redescribe, or recode past events so contemporary cultures can make sense of their past. Histories, then, are similar to fiction because figurative language is used in both genres to help us come to know the actual by contrasting it with or likening it to the imaginable. Thus both historical narratives and fiction employ similar strategies in making sense of past events, whether they are real or imagined. 98. White's arguments make an important contribution to historiography because his argument provides historians with a means to develop a historical consciousness by helping them recognize the fictive elements in their historical narratives. 99. Preceding James Berlin, who argues we must be aware of the ideological underpinnings of any history we create, White writes, this recognition would serve as a potent antidote to the tendency of historians to become captive of ideological preconceptions which they do not recognize as such but honor as the correct perception of the way things really are. 99. As White explains, the ideological is the fictive element in our own discourse. Therefore, by becoming aware of how they employ tropes, historians become cognizant of when they are making ideological moves. Although White does not mention rhetoric, I would add that in the process, historians would also become aware of the rhetorical elements in their histories. After all, when we become aware of the ideological moves we make in our discourse, we are also becoming rhetorically savvy. Thus, while history may very well be closely aligned with literature, history is also closely aligned with rhetoric. Although this point may seem obvious to us rhetoricians, do all historians think of their work as rhetorical? How would histories be different if they did? Linking history with literature is useful for rhetorical scholars in the sense that just as historians must develop a historical consciousness, so too must all scholars within our field. White explains that, like literature, history progresses by the production of classics, the nature of which is such that they cannot be disconfirmed or negated, and that it is their non-disconfirmability that testifies to the essentially literary nature of historical classics. 89. As we all know, the ancient rhetorical canon is strong and narrow. With the publishing of Reclaiming Rhetorica and Rhetoric Retold and other texts such as Rhetoric Before and Beyond the Greeks, the ancient rhetorical canon is slowly being expanded, but by and large, we know the history of our field through canonical texts. If we think of the canon as a grand narrative of the history of rhetoric, what are the tropes at play that have guided the way we think about our discipline's past? What mythos has been created? What is imagined? What is real? What ideologies have been at play when these canonical texts have been reproduced? These questions are important for us to ask and explore because, as Kellner reminds us, we cannot have reality, but we can claim it, and we do claim it, with rhetoric. 36. Therefore, we do not actually know the reality of the history of rhetoric even though the rhetorical canon makes a claim that we do. This contrived sense of reality is why we must develop a historical consciousness of our own field. We must, in White's terms, develop a metahistory of rhetoric so we begin to acknowledge, recognize, and understand how and why our discipline's history has been created the way it has, who this historical narrative benefits, and who this historical narrative doesn't. Developing a metahistory of our field is also important because we need to be acutely aware that when we rewrite history, we also rewrite the present. Atwill explains that canons, as well as theories and methodologies, incorporate the values of a disciplinary community, reinforcing the community's own referential status by reproducing its values and affirming its practices. 104. Therefore, when we rewrite history, we incorporate contemporary values, which led us to ask new questions and develop new insights. These values, beliefs, questions, and insights guide our research and our presentation of that history and thus lead to the creation of a new history, which in turn leads to a new understanding of the present. As Berlin reminds us, when we write history, we also create our hopes and visions for the future, therefore, by rewriting history, we also rewrite our future. Seen in this light, as rhetorical scholars, part of the historical consciousness we must develop should focus on the kind of present and future we want to create for our discipline. We must imagine how our discipline will change as we begin to add alternative histories to the canon. How has it already changed? How do we want it to change? We must also ask what ideologies are at work in our field and our sense of scholarly self that make us want and not want to add alternative histories to the already established canon, or give them priority when we teach rhetoric, both of which would change both our present and our future. White's argument is important to rhetorical studies because it reminds, even inspires us to ask such important questions. It helps us develop our own historical consciousness both as a discipline and individual scholars.